This is the pre-lab talk for Experiment 1, Observing and Recording Properties. This is for Gen Chem 1 Lab, or Chem 110, at the University of Pittsburgh. The goals for this experiment is to help you to become more familiar with the laboratory setting and standard lab equipment. In this experiment, we're going to be using the Bunsen burner and a centrifuge. We're also going to use a variety of spatulas and tongs to handle chemical reagents and glassware. Another important goal for this experiment is to practice recording observations and drawing conclusions from those observations. Here's our safety pause for today's experiment. The first important safety reminder is that we want to make sure that we wear our personal protective equipment in lab. For this lab, I'll be wearing a lab coat, which for this class, it's required that we use flame-resistant lab coats, chemical splash goggles, and for certain parts of the experiment, I'll be wearing gloves. Another important safety feature for this lab is the handling of hot items. We'll be using an open flame and heating up test tubes. We'll also be heating reagents on a metal microspatula that's directly put in the Bunsen burner flame. It's important to use care when handling hot objects. Never touch a hot object with your hands. Always use tongs or holders to hold any glassware that is put directly in a flame. The third important safety notice here is handling corrosives. Hydrochloric acid and copper 2-chloride hexahydrate are both corrosive. This is why for certain parts of the experiment I'll be wearing my gloves. For waste disposal for this experiment, sand will go into a specially labeled container so that it does not clog up the plumbing in the chemistry building. We'll also be disposing of cobalt 2-chloride hexahydrate since it's an environmental hazard. All other reagents will be flushed down the drain with plenty of running water. There are a couple of concepts that we should go over before completing this experiment. The first important concept is thinking and understanding skill number 3, and that is that observations lead to explanations, conclusions, and questions. In many of the labs in this course, you'll be asked to make observations of chemical phenomenon that you observe. When you record your observations, it's important that you remember the 3 C's. The first is you want to make sure that your observations are complete. Write down everything that you see that's related to the reaction that you're taking a look at. Record any color changes in temperature, or any other types of phenomenon that you observe. The second thing to remember is that you want your observations to be clear. You want to state very specifically what you see in the clearest language that you can use. In the sciences, it's not important to use a lot of long prose. It's just simply to write down what you see. And this brings us to the last point. You want to write a concise observation. There's no need to write a paragraph when you just simply observe that a solution turned blue. Your observations can lead you to do 2 things. The first, which we're not going to do too much of in this experiment, but will in the future, is you might be asked to explain what you've seen. When you explain your observations, you're going to use chemical concepts learned in both lecture and in lab. You might also be asked to draw conclusions about your observations. This is usually you're looking at When you draw conclusions, you're making a statement about patterns or observations that you've seen. This is made using your experimental data only. You're not asked to use any other chemical concepts to draw conclusions. Just look for certain patterns relative to your experiment. An example of a conclusion is looking at whether or not a reaction occurs. If you make an observation that when you mix two reagents together, your resulting solution changes from colorless to blue, you might conclude that a reaction occurred. You don't have to explain what reaction occurred or why the reaction occurred. Just simply state that a reaction occurred between the two reagents. If you observe no color change, you might conclude that no reaction occurred. These statements are made based on what you see in the experimental data. You might also have questions about your observations. And this is fine, especially when you're starting out in chemistry. If you have questions about any of your observations, it's important that you talk to either your lab instructor or myself, the lab coordinator. We're there to help you. You can also talk to your lecture professor, or in many cases, your peers. Another important concept in this experiment is intensive versus extensive properties. Intensive properties do not depend on the amount of chemical reagent. Examples of intensive properties include color, phase of matter, color or phase of matter. An extensive property is a property that does depend on amount. The solubility of a compound does depend on the amount of compound. For example, if we look at the solubility of a particular solid in water, that solubility will depend on not only the amount of solid that is being dissolved, but the amount of water that's there. Now let's move on to looking at some specific procedural points. The first point is you'll notice that we'll turn on the air capture units for these experiments. The air capture units provide ventilation, some extra ventilation to keep us safe from certain noxious toxic fumes or odors. We usually use the air capture units when we're heating up a substance or doing a reaction that produces a noxious gas. We're also going to use some new equipment and techniques for this experiment, which will be demonstrated as we go along in the video. We're going to use a Bunsen burner, which is a simple natural gas burner used to heat chemical reactions. Some important safety features to remember is that you never want to leave a Bunsen burner turned on and unattended. You also want to make sure that the gas is completely turned off when you're finished using the burner. The other piece of equipment that we're going to be using is the centrifuge. Centrifuges use centrifugal force to separate a solid from a liquid. Your sample is placed in a small test tube, placed in a centrifuge, and is allowed to spin for usually 2 to 3 minutes. We'll go over some important safety features of the centrifuge in the lab video. In this experiment, we're going to also be using very small amounts of chemicals, mainly because this is a qualitative experiment, meaning we're not really interested in specific amounts of chemicals, but only observing chemical phenomenon. A small amount of chemical can be found in a picture of a small amount of a chemical can be found in your procedure. This small amount will be used for all heatings and all reactions. Another important thing to keep in mind is it's really important that you're patient when observing chemical phenomenon. Sometimes chemistry takes a little bit of time to occur. If something doesn't occur right away, don't think anything is wrong. It can mean two things. Either the reaction takes a lot of time, or that there's no reaction to observe.